Welcome. My goal in this short video is to discuss one of the attributes of God which I like best, that being his inclination to side with and uphold the little people, men and women, who could be considered in some way to be weak, unfavored, etc. I'll first point out how this theme runs throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, from the ancient prophets on up to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Then I'll focus on a few stories involving individuals who fit in this category of being lesser, like Hagar and Ishmael, Esau, Leah, Uriah, and Lazarus the beggar. And finally, I'll summarize Jesus' lessons showing how God frequently values our humility, obedience, and service over our societal rank. As usual, I'm just pulling from Scripture and adding my comments. Let's begin with some Old Testament quotes about the downtrodden, and see how they flow into the New Testament. One doesn't have to look very hard for examples. I'll try not to overdo the Bible references, but please have patience. Deuteronomy clarifies that God watches over the fatherless and widows, and loves the stranger among us. Or, consider the passage from Isaiah, chapter 66, in which God states that he will look to, that is, he will intently regard those who society might consider the little guy, but who display a proper attitude toward the Most High, explaining that even though the heavens are the Lord's throne and the earth his footstool, yet will he respect the poor man who possesses a contrite spirit, and who trembles with reverence at his word. The term contrite means penitent, or repentant, by the way. When we hear Christ famously say, in his Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he's quite likely referencing, at least, the Isaiah quote cited above. And, also perhaps the similar Isaiah, chapter 57, which specifies the spiritual traits of those with whom God will choose to share his heavenly kingdom. Thus says the high and lofty one, who inhabits eternity, and whose name is holy. I will dwell in the high and holy place. I will dwell there with him that is of a contrite and humble spirit. When Jesus pronounced, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted," he's again referring, at least, to the Isaiah chapter 61 passages which he also claimed to fulfill in the synagogue at Nazareth, which say in part, "The Spirit of God has sent me to comfort those that mourn, to give unto them beauty for ashes, joy for mourning, a garment of praise for their spirit of heaviness." As an aside, he may be referring here more generally to those in suffering and/or distress. Christ likely took his saying, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," directly from the Old Testament's Psalm number 37, a masterpiece of King David's, in which he contrasted the fates of good and evil people. And of course, the Isaiah chapter 61 verses mentioned above are also relevant. "The Spirit of God is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek." Summarizing a bit here then, this is all to say, again, that this theme of God favoring the weak, mistreated, etc. spans the Old and New Testaments. And there are plenty of other examples too, but this is enough for now. Moving on, let's now examine the stories of several individuals who fall in this category of lesser, such as Hagar and Ishmael, Esau, Leah, Uriah, and Lazarus the beggar. Recall from way back in Genesis that Abraham and Sarah had decided, without first consulting God, that they would essentially help him fulfill his promise to Abraham that he would produce numerous descendants, and that they would accomplish this by having Abraham father a child by Hagar, an Egyptian slave belonging to Sarah. Unsurprisingly, this misguided decision quickly resulted in marital strife and other longer-term problems. Hagar, of course, had up until then been quite powerless, but as soon as she knew that she had conceived, Sarah became, quote, despised in her eyes, sort of reminding us of the old saying, "The bottom rail is on top now." Understandably, Sarah was upset. She confronted Abraham, and he simply told her to deal with Hagar as she saw fit. After Sarah treated her harshly, Hagar ran away. An angel intercepted Hagar, though, and told her to return to Sarah and submit to her. The angel promised, and foretold that Hagar would have a son, and that she would name him Ishmael, which means, God hears, because the Lord had heard her affliction, and further, that her seed would, over time, be innumerable. He also predicted that Ishmael would be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Later, this bad situation came even further to a head when Abraham was forced to choose between Sarah and Hagar and her son Ishmael were as a result sent away from the family. But even here, God was with them. Throughout all this, we see his fairness to, and protection of Ishmael and his mother Hagar. Turning now to the story of Esau. God had prophesied his underdog status, even prior to his birth, to his mother, Rebekah. And it didn't just apply to Esau, but his descendants as well. Stepping back a little, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were of course the three patriarchs of Israel, and Esau was Jacob's elder twin brother. As firstborn, Esau would normally have received what is known as the birthright from his father, Isaac, but Genesis records that Jacob persuaded Esau to trade it to him in exchange for merely a meal. This birthright was a weighty matter. It carried numerous benefits, including a double portion of inheritance, a ceremonial blessing from their father, Isaac, authority within the family, etc. The Bible faults Esau, at least partially, for selling it so lightly. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Jacob, by conspiring with his mother, Rebekah, later tricked Isaac into formally bestowing his blessing on him, rather than Esau. When Esau found out, he was naturally furious, in spite of being so willing earlier to sell his birthright. On reading his plaintive and pitiful reaction, one can't help but feel some sorrow for him. With a bitter cry, he begged, "Bless me too, Father." But Isaac replied, "Look, I have made Jacob your Lord with my blessing, and what shall I do now for you, my son?" Esau went on to plead, "Don't you have even one blessing left for me, Father?" And he lifted his voice and wept. Isaac did then respond with a limited and prophetic blessing, basically predicting that although Esau's descendants would live restlessly under the rule of Jacob's, yet they would, at least on occasion, also successfully revolt. Esau's descendants were called the Edomites, by the way, and Jacob's the Israelites. Jacob was later renamed Israel by God himself, after God's and his famous wrestling match, which is another story. In spite of all this, God didn't forget Esau, but rather blessed him, even though the Lord's covenant would ultimately be fulfilled through Jacob's line. I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't mention that the Edomites would later fall from favor with God due to their sins. Let's now pivot to the story of Leah, another woman, who like Hagar and her son, Ishmael, was elevated by the Lord after he had witnessed her shabby treatment at the hands of men, primarily Jacob, but as with so many biblical stories, it's complicated. As above, Jacob had connived and schemed his whole life, and he, in turn, received trickery and deceit. After fooling his father, Isaac, into bestowing Esau's birthright upon him, Jacob had been forced to flee to his uncle Laban's, because Esau earnestly intended to kill him. Jacob fell madly in love with Rachel, Laban's daughter. Laban, exploiting this, promised her to Jacob in marriage if he'd work for him for 7 years. Jacob fulfilled his part of the bargain. In fact, the Bible notes poetically that he was so smitten with Rachel, the years passed as but a few days. But then Laban tricked him by secretly sending his elder daughter, Leah, in to Jacob on his wedding night. Jacob asked why Laban had deceived him, since he had worked, as agreed, for Rachel. Laban claimed that it was against custom to grant the younger daughter before the elder, but he agreed to give Rachel to Jacob at the end of Leah's week of wedding, provided Jacob agreed to work an additional 7 years, which he did. Jacob openly preferred Rachel to Leah, and, when the Lord saw Leah was hated, he let Leah bear children. Meanwhile, Rachel was barren. The Bible's description of Leah is brief, but touching. It makes clear, in sort of a subtle way, that she wasn't as physically attractive as Rachel. The King James translation states that her eyes were, quote, tender, but in other translations her eyes were described as weak, which probably meant they were bleary. In contrast, Rachel was described as beautiful and well-favored. Due to God's help, though, Leah produced Jacob's first son, Reuben, and eventually 6 in total, including Judah, from whom King David, and, even more notably, Christ descended. I mentioned above that this situation was complicated. Think about it. Jacob never wanted Leah. He'd been tricked into marrying her. Also, Rachel seems to have been punished, at least short-term, for Jacob's then treating Leah poorly. But having said that, Rachel did in time give Jacob his 2 favorite sons, Joseph and Benjamin, which is another story in itself. In the end, though, between Rachel, Leah, and their handmaids they bore Jacob 12 sons, from whom descended the 12 tribes of Israel. Shifting gears now to discuss Uriah, whose life was unjustly taken and his wife stolen. Unfortunately, God could only stand up for him after the fact. Personally, I find this story depressing, but toward its end I'll point out at least a few uplifting aspects. It's shocking in that Uriah's murder came at the hands of one who we would, aside from this, call one of the true heroes of faith. No less than King David, the most frequently cited ancestor of Christ and one of the most revered leaders in the Bible. 2 Samuel paints an expressive picture of how the seeds of David's temptation were planted. In an eveningtide, David arose from off his bed, and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Though he knew she, Bathsheba, was one of his own men's wives, he coveted her, he slept with her, and she became pregnant. This is pretty bad, but caution, it gets a lot worse. David, with the intent of deceiving Uriah, her husband, into believing that the child was his, recalled him from battle and encouraged him to spend time at home with his wife. But Uriah's integrity was so great that he refused to take his ease while his companions and fellow soldiers fought, asking, "The army is in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house, to eat and to drink, and to lie with my wife? As you and I live, I won't do this." Instead, he slept at the door of the king's house with all the king's servants. When his initial deception was foiled by the stubborn honor of Uriah, David then conspired to have his faithful soldier killed in battle, and took Bathsheba for his own wife. In a particularly horrible detail, he had Uriah, by his own hand, secretly deliver David's instructions to his general, Joab, to ensure that Uriah was killed. I'm certainly not in a position to judge anyone, but the fact that David, who had shown such faith in, and closeness with God, would apparently forget that the Lord sees everything, and not recognize that he would hate such despicable behavior, is just frankly baffling. And God did indeed confront David by sending the prophet Nathan to him with the following symbolic story. A poor man only possessed one small lamb whom he loved, but a rich man who had many sheep killed that poor man's lamb. After David heard this, he angrily pronounced the following judgment on the culprit. "As the Lord lives, the man that has done this thing shall surely die." And then Nathan revealed to him that he, David, was that man. God's further condemnation of him was memorable too. "Here I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you his house, and his wives, and gave you both the houses of Israel and Judah. And if that wasn't enough, I would have given you more." Why have you then despised my commandment, to do this evil in my sight? David repented, and God did let him live, but he also punished him in various ways, including the death of David and Bathsheba's child, ongoing rebellions, etc. As promised, here are the uplifting lessons I can salvage from this otherwise miserable tale. God sees everything. He can show mercy if we repent, and He stands up for the little guy. As a final individual example, God will also be fair in the afterlife, as shown by Jesus' parable of the beggar Lazarus and the rich man, as related in Luke, chapter 16. Christ's parable illustrates how those who are rich in this life, but who ignore the plight of those less fortunate, could fare in the life to come, and conversely how those who were disadvantaged may be rewarded. Of course, the fact that our earthly behavior influences our destiny in the afterlife goes to the very heart of the Lord's extraordinarily just nature. Now, let's briefly turn to a broader summary of a couple of Jesus' lessons which illustrate that God sometimes values our humility, obedience, and service over our societal rank. Christ showed, in the following story, that God, at least in some cases, ranks humility and obedience over our relative position in mankind's pecking order. The Gospels explain that shortly after Jesus had informed them the second time that he must be killed in sacrifice, his disciples disputed among themselves who would be greatest in his kingdom. It seems a bit strange that this argument arose so soon after Christ's somber revelation, but keep in mind that in his transfiguration, which occurred shortly before this episode, some of them could have been viewed as having received preferential treatment. That is, Peter, James, and John had been singled out to witness the miracle. Anyway, Jesus reacted to their argument by graphically clarifying an important requirement for entering his kingdom. He called a little child, and set him in the middle, and said, "Unless you become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whoever shall humble himself, as this little child, will be the greatest there." Some claim that he meant by this that we are to strive for more childlike attributes such as open-mindedness, trust, lack of corruption, etc. And there could of course be some truth to this. However, the context seems of greater importance here. In other words, the issue at hand, the one he was discussing with his disciples, was the overriding need we humans have to establish a pecking order, to define a social scale based on our abilities, leadership skills, achievements, and so forth. Jesus appears to be saying here that the kingdom of heaven, in contrast to this natural, material approach, honors, rewards, and more importantly requires and demands instead humility. If we approach his kingdom full of pride, boastful, glorying in our accomplishments and position, we are likely to be disappointed. In this world, these very human obsessions regarding our relative ranks, and the esteem in which we are, or are not, held by others, frequently cause us anxiety and fear, but in the world to come not only are they discounted, they can be disqualifying and prohibitive. We are to worry less about what others think of us, and more about what God thinks. Having said all this though, the Bible makes it clear we are to leverage all our talents, including that of leadership, for the sake of God's kingdom. For example, Moses, Joshua, and King David were all needed and valued. In addition to emphasizing humility, Jesus repeatedly reinforced the importance, within his kingdom, of serving, as opposed to being served. This can be seen, for example, in the washing of his disciples' feet at his Last Supper. Also see the related verses of Mark in which Christ had made this same point, saying, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. But it shall not be this way among you. Whoever will be great among you, shall be your minister. And whoever will be the chiefest, shall be servant of all." This same sentiment is expressed in other parts of the Gospel as well. Summing up briefly then, we looked at how the theme of God standing up for the, quote, little guy, runs throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, from the ancient prophets on up to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We looked in more detail at a few stories involving individuals who fit in this category of lesser, like Hagar and Ishmael, Esau, Leah, Uriah, and Lazarus the beggar. And finally, we reviewed a broader summary of Jesus' illustrations that God often values our humility, obedience, and service over our societal rank. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please check out my Amazon Kindle book, from which much of this content was pulled. It's called A Simple Take on God. It'll set you back 99 cents. I'll put some instructions on how to find it in the comments of the video.